Welcome to Antidote Radio. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth Kushel.
Okay, so Jeremy, lost in all of the conversation this week about healthcare and all of the fear mongering and paranoia going on both sides of the left-right divide about healthcare. Actually, the left-right very similar to each other, but the paradigm about healthcare and what this healthcare bill is going to do to the people compared to what the other one did, and all that stuff that you and I stay away from because we're not experts on this matter as it is. But in lost in all of that, we've had a couple of interesting events. One is that Trump announced his first foreign policy visit of his administration is going to be to Saudi Arabia, to Israel, and to the Vatican, which under a different president who was not defended by the anti-establishment grassroots conspiracy-oriented right-wing community would be you'd see about 1,000 YouTube videos probably up by about now about how Obama is bringing about the New World Order by going to all the religious centers of the world. But we're not seeing that with Trump. So now that's a very symbolic trip, and it could be that Trump is going to Saudi Arabia to I guess continue to build a closer alliance between friendly Arab countries, and who knows what that's going to regard. Is it going to be about a common front against Iran or what that's going to be? And then he's going to Israel, where it's going to coincide with the celebration 50th anniversary of the Israeli Jerusalem Day, which this year's 50th anniversary of the annexation of the West Bank, of course, which has been the key driving point in the debate over the borders of Israel-Palestine and that whole thing going back to the Six-Day War in '67. And also this week, there's a very interesting celebration of Israel's Independence Day, directly following Donald Trump's statement at the Israel's Holocaust Remembrance Day, which, of course, he was cast over the iron, raked over the coals for not acknowledging the global Holocaust Remembrance Day, but he went out of his way to address Israel's Holocaust Remembrance Day. And on top of this, we had just this week a celebration of Israel Independence Day at the White House, and among the all kinds of people. Movers and shakers from within the pro-Zionist community were there. Alan Dershowitz, who we've talked about extensively. Jonathan Greenblatt of the Anti-Defamation League was there. Countless others, the ambassadors of Israel, all the major Israelis who were involved in actually live here, who were working on behalf of Israel in terms of diplomats and all that, were there. And another one was Rabbi Schmuley Boteach, a hardcore Orthodox Zionist rabbi who's been very supportive of Donald Trump and his policies. And what struck out most to me from this White House Israel Independence Day celebration was the pictures that Rabbi Schmuley took with Steve Bannon. The picture that's kind of gone viral of Steve Bannon's whiteboard with his proposed campaign promises written on the background. And anyway, in these, Boteach put out a couple of tweets saying that he's proud to pose with Steve Bannon and proud to be able to spend time with this stalwart defender and friend of Israel and the Jewish people. And even put out a tweet linking to a Breitbart article he wrote where he just praises Steve Bannon about how great of a friend of Israel and the Jews he is. Bannon's record on supporting Israel and opposing #genocidal Iran has been strong, and I'm grateful. And that's worth saying that two of the promises on the whiteboard everybody seemed to ignore when they went on about all the immigration-related rhetoric in the on his whiteboard were the promises to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and to get rid of the Iran nuclear deal. I think in a large way this is very important because the Trump base has been given this false narrative fed to them by people from all over the alternative right spectrum about how Kushner and the globalists, or if you're David Duke or Andrew Anglin or whoever, the Jews are manipulating and taking over Trump's campaign and have usurped his campaign, and they're making him do things or influencing him to do things through the influence of his daughter, who has his ear, things he doesn't want to do. And meanwhile, it completely leaves out any sort of critical narrative of just exactly what Steve Bannon and Breitbart and this entire what we coined the term the last time we had a show here, the philo Zionist hardcore promoters of represent, and what their goals are for not just for the Trump administration and for America, but for the Middle East and the world in general.
Yes, and this This is such an interesting photo mainly in terms of people's reactions to it, because you have both sides that are allegedly represented here, uh, reacting to each other and talking about how this photo and this kind of relationship discredits their figure in the photo, whether it's Boteach or Bannon. And so for the hardcore sort of Israel firsters and sort of and the Jewish community that's intensely obsessed with only like Jewish politics, they see Boteach talking to Bannon as a sort of conversing with the white nationalist enemy, and Bannon is the guy who's allowed all these Jew haters to go on Breitbart and whip up a frenzy of anti-Semitism against
Like David
Jewish
Horowitz.
Right, and then the Bannon supporters, the aspect of the Bannon supporters that are sort of like maybe Jew obsessed, we may say, who see everything as ethnic and racial in some way, then see this as the good goy white nationalist Bannon as being compromised by his relationship with the Jew or the Jews, or that type of thing. And of course, the analysis that we've continued to do from before the election into the interregnum and into the Trump administration shows that this is a false dialectic of many ways. We've pointed out Breitbart as coming directly out of Jerusalem in many ways, and targeting the white right in many ways for a new Zionist box to be put into. And in a previous show, we came up with the term white Zionists, and that this was the missing, a white Zionist supremacist actually, or a white Zionist nationalist, and that this is what was missing on both sides of these kind of equations, was this term Zionism. And of course, this is the type of thing that gets under a lot of people's skins, whether you're a white nationalist or a Jewish nationalist, let's say. This is the type of thing that gets under your skin because it deals with aspects of ethnic supremacism. And if you're a white nationalist, it shows that it's not only about Jewish supremacism. And if you're a Jewish nationalist, it shows that it's not only about white supremacism. And so that type of thing. So then also what's very interesting about this is this has a different feel. People are saying that this seems like Bannon's in this picture is being kidnapped, or sort of similar to the very strange video that of Donald Trump that allegedly was an Easter message that primarily focused on the Jewish people and Passover, but it was framed as an Easter message that did have the feel of a kidnapping photo of some sort, a kidnapping video of some sort, a sort of maybe a Jewish ISIS video of some sort with a captured executive. And but this doesn't seem like that at all to me. This looks like, yeah, okay, this is a coalition. This is our coalition, and we're maintaining it. And you can look at our whiteboard about all the things, and you can see, and you pointed this out very clearly that the Trump rhetoric is very similar to the Netanyahu rhetoric, and the sort of the long board here, the half of the board is about the pledges on immigration, and then you see how this then conflicts with aspects of what I would see as the real patriotic right that was much more constitutionally based, much more libertarian based. And in this, you see things like finally complete the biometric entry-exit visa, and I think I've mentioned before that as in the transition into the Trump administration, there was a lot of reporting that one of the big things that they were going to do was escalate the biometrics inside of Homeland Security, and as we've had direct personal experience with, it looks like, in terms of the Kansas City Public Library, that this kind of biometric software is very much directly tied back to the core of the Israeli military intelligence sector. So that's I guess is where the agreement is building walls that are probably built by built by Boeing or Lockheed contractors, plus with Israeli military intelligence software backends, and maybe the Zionist Jewish owner of Home Depot can get some of the spoils too.
Indeed, and that's something that I didn't really take from the whiteboard with some of those promises, and that to me is the reason why somebody like what I've referred to as John Ashcroft on steroids, Jeff Sessions, has been put in place as the attorney general to be the one to crack down when that proverbial shit hits the fan moment happens with whatever comes that's going to be the big event of the Trump administration that's going to change everything, which I think both of us foresee is happening sometime in the next 4 years. Not sure when, but that'll be the reason for that. And it's funny to hear all these dystopian people who are so upset about a police state, or at least have been in the past, certain Infowars.com proprietors, but they're just completely okay with the Trump administration putting these policies in, as long as it's America first and as long as it cracks down on Mexican immigrants and Muslims and other people who we can blame for all of our problems. It's perfectly fine. But I think with regards to Bannon and Boteach here is that it's very clear that Bannon, as you said, it seems like it was just like a camaraderie. These guys were just coming together, old friends, just coming together to express how much they love one another. And we've completely, and one of the causes we talked about in our last show, where we went through the history of this movement and how it's being used now, is that the primary goal of these people that are behind Trump is to not so much Trump himself as it is the legitimacy of the movement that made it possible for Trump to be president. And very clearly we've so many people have completely overlooked, ignored altogether, and just flat out dismissed just how important of an aspect of an asset to this cause Steve Bannon and his Breitbart Conceived in Israel website and his financiers like Robert Mercer are to this whole equation. They're just as important and just as big a power players as Jared Kushner is, and that is completely being neglected from this rhetoric.
Yes, and it's definitely the case that it does, to me, it really does look like this is the first what Israelis thought was their completely owned executive. And we've pointed this out before, that although there's been a very strong influence over the executive branch by Zionist power and the Israeli government, that they've never quite yet had someone that didn't push back against their deepest desires, whether it was Obama or even W or Clinton or even HW or Reagan. I mean, there's always been a sense of that, or definitely Carter, and all the way back, of course, to Kennedy, which was of the ultimate, in many ways, singular event before September 11th that pointed out this relationship between this sort of white supremacist Anglo-American set that's most sort of intensely seen as like the Dulles brothers and their tie back to elements of British imperialism, which of course also has a very strong Zionist bent, a strong tie into the Rothschilds. And then this more direct Israeli, intensely sort of Jewish mob-based global power that's focused around, maybe its epicenter is New York. And of course that also has financial tiebacks to the City of London too. But they teamed up on the extraction, the liquidation of what was becoming a problem character in John F. Kennedy. And there were, of course, overlapping reasons for that partnership to undo him. But someone like a James Jesus Angleton, the head of counterintelligence in the CIA, and coincidentally, or not so much coincidentally, also the head of the Israel desk, and a man who actually has a monument to him in Israel, supposedly. He's sort of the key operational figure that tied together both the reasons for the assassination of John F. Kennedy, but also the operations of the assassination itself, and then, still importantly, the cover-up of all of that. So that history is really important to unpack. And in our previous podcast together, we talked about the John Birch Society and their role as playing sort of like the Al-Qaeda of the anti-communist right in the United States in terms of the Kennedy assassination, and the tying of it into allegedly grassroots discontent against the softness of Kennedy against the communist world. So this relationship between the white supremacists and the Jewish supremacists goes way back, and it's not as clear-cut in distinction as sort of pointed out in terms of the Rothschild's ties to the white supremacists, you might call them, and then the Rothschild's ties to the Jewish supremacists. But there's all kinds of other factors in the background behind all of that. And in many ways, what's most important for us, the people on the ground, to understand is how these are actually presented to us as boxes for us to get into so that we don't talk to each other. So that when we see a picture of Bannon and Boteach, the sense is to react to it and further spin away from talking to other people rather than doing an analysis and talking with each other about the analysis in a very specific fashion.
Yeah, absolutely. So true. And real quick before we get into our next topic, I think you kind of almost laid the groundwork to get into our next topic here with the final comments you made. But it's important to point out that neocons, like what we call neocons, or people who are have a more hawkish foreign policy, and especially regards to Israel in particular and the Middle East in general, that they're not in lockstep agreement on every matter that there is. I for so long believed that neocons simply represented what people like William Kristol said. And I think there was almost in some ways a very clever and kind of some ways method to the madness in a way of representing somebody like Bill Kristol as being like the face of neoconservatism. You don't realize, unless you're paying attention really closely, that there's a whole other wing to this, which we've talked about before. We've described as the Israel first and Israel second, but it goes beyond that. It goes into just the general people, old school Cold War culture wars old school Cold War people who wanted to just bring down the Soviet regime or whatever, or to increase our arms and military might in case of a war with the Soviets, which they claim with their revisionist history. Ronald Reagan brought down the Soviets because we peace through strength. We increased the military power under Reagan and all that. And now they're just wanting to want to push the idea of the war on terror and increase the U.S. military's ability to be able to be given all these means to do these things that we continue doing in the world, to continue having the boogeyman of an enemy. And you've got this whole other wing that was so long in the shadows back in the PNAC days and in the days when it was just like the right-wing fringe media outlets like Joe Farah's WorldNet Daily and Larry Klayman's Judicial Watch and whoever else Richard Mellon Scaife was funding at the time, when they were just putting out their attacks on Bill and Hillary Clinton in the 90s, that now has come full circle with the attacks on Obama, going after him based on his religious, whatever they say about his religious preferences and his connections to radical Islam. And it's come full circle. We've got this other wing that is all about just pushing a conflict with Islam and is all about pushing a more like actually hard right domestic policy in the United States. We got to remember when Bush was president, WorldNet Daily and these other right-wing outlets that are representing the Trump movement now, they were not complimentary of Bush's domestic policies. That was the Weekly Standard crowd that was complimenting his domestic policies, which they see as being more centrist or even laughably liberal. and we're seeing that now where it wasn't when Bill Kristol was represented in the people who were the never Trumpers, they were represented as being the entire neocon movement, but in reality they weren't. And I think that's very important to point out, because we're seeing now the neocons that were against Trump. They were the same ones who loved Bush, and we're seeing this crowd that was so long in the shadows, that were kind of just on the back burner so long, and they still are in many ways, the forces behind Trump within the media and think tanks. They didn't have a love affair with George Bush. Yes, they supported his foreign policy, particularly after September 11th, but even then they had some problems with some of the things he did. So we're seeing now this is not something that's new, this dynamic of like the neocons opposing Trump, and this is not representative of what all of these people think. I think that's important to point out.
Yeah, and at the same time, I think it's important to emphasize how deep their agreement on the clash of civilizations aspect of the foreign policy actually is, and also potentially the Semitic oriented against the Arab and Muslim people aspect of the police state at home that they both apparently support. Because it is important to see like such figures as Jerome Corsi, and Jerome Corsi played a key role in selecting George W. Bush. And it's important to look at the way that he did that in terms of, I believe he was a key orchestrator and even wrote a book that was oriented towards the swift boat veterans, to sort of attacking Kerry from the military angle, because where George Bush was already most vulnerable was about the war in Iraq, and how it was obviously already being seen as a disaster for all ethical and rational people in the United States of America. And so what they did was they attacked Kerry from his military background, because of course George W. Bush's military background is very there's a lot of questions there, there's a lot of shadiness there, and so that's very important to see that even if there were some disagreements about the domestic policy of George W. Bush, people like WorldNet Daily, Jerome Corsi were committed enough to making sure that the escalation, the doubling down of the violent involvement of the United States in the Middle East against Israel's perceived political nemesis was ultimate, at the very least penultimate, in terms of their politics, and that they were willing to play very dirty in order to get W a second stolen administration. And not that John Kerry and the Democrats would have represented a complete de-escalation, but there was some difference of direction in relationship to Iraq at the time. So that's important to see, is that when it comes down to it, that the Israel first neocons and the Israel second neocons are very much aligned in terms of the impetus to have the United States violently involved against large portions of the Muslim world, especially in the Middle East, surrounding Israel. So I think that's a key piece of this. And of course, it is the case that the neoconservatism in many ways has been used to cloak aspects of Jewish Zionist power, and that it's set up as a sort of a cloaking umbrella in a way, and that in the mainstream media you won't hear anything even suggesting that, except from elite liberal Jewish Zionists, apparently, such as from Tom Friedman, who we pointed out made a statement that 25 neoconservatives, most of them Jewish, were responsible for the Iraq War, or at least the Iraq War wouldn't have happened without them. And then Carl Bernstein on Morning Joe talking about the largely Jewish neoconservatives, and
you could add Peter Beinart to that list as well.
So there you go, and at the same time as like these sort of liberal Jews, media, sort of media influencers are allowed to say such things about the ethnic and political commitments of the neoconservatives. and maybe ethno-religious political commitments of the neoconservatives. The rest of the society is not allowed to talk about that, including the Israel lobby, the pushback against the Walton Mearsheimer Israel lobby hypothesis and book, where they were even accused of anti-Semitism, and after that didn't work, there's finally a public debate that was highly controlled, and people should go look at the debate that took place amongst I think it was Mearsheimer, or maybe it was Walt. No, I think it was Mearsheimer, and on the other side was Dennis Ross and Martin Indyk, and with the Israel lobby hypothesis was Rashid Khalidi from Colombia, and even he, who's not willing to go to the depths of some of the critical analysis of Jewish power in the United States of America, especially, he made this point of that, we're trying to talk about this in a way that avoids the domestic political pervasive influence of what we're terming the Israel lobby. And even like people like Noam Chomsky and Amy Goodman did their best to avoid it in the case of Amy Goodman, or even ridicule it in the case of Noam Chomsky, who, by the way, appears to, when he was at in UCLA, I think in 2010 maybe, or something like that, I pointed out that the war on terror was ethnic in its dimensions when he was trying to downplay the role of what he called an ethnic lobby, the Israeli lobby. And but of course, I was pointed out the war on terror is ethnic. It's been directed against Semitic people. It's been directed against a very specific group of Muslim people. Islam is a Semitic religion, and Arabs are Semitic ethnicity. And the war on terror has been shaped very directly against them by another ethno-religious political force emanating out of Tel Aviv. So there is an aspect of this where even these breaks amongst the neoconservatives, it's important for us to analyze them, especially in terms of finding weak points to sort of open it up, and also for helping people who get stuck in one box or another, or in the newest sort of neocon 2.0 and think that they are American firsters when they're really sort of just Israel firsters, maybe. That we need to be able to talk about the actual ethno-religious political umbrella to the neoconservatives.
Yeah, and that's a very key point about how these groups came together after September 11th, and in the lead up to September 11th, is of course, Frank Gaffney was one of the signers of the Project for a New American Century document, which laid out what the Middle East would look like after September 11th. And it is very important to point that out. And once again, I think with Trump, you're going to see them come together again once the inevitable wherever the major, what I believe is coming, is the major war is going to be launched under the Trump administration. We're going to see those different classes in the neoconservative, hawkish war against terrorism and Islam contingent are going to come together. Because remember, keep in mind that the area where the Trump has been most complimented by his perceived enemies within the neocon establishment are on areas of foreign policy where he's taken a, quote, strong stance, like whether it's putting Iran on notice or whether it's dropping Tomahawk missiles on Syria. These are the areas that he's still getting the most applause from these people. So we're clearly going to see another convergence where they come together, and at the very least, the conversations from within these groups are going to be so that people don't realize the true depths of what we believe is actually going on behind the scenes. Now we've been covering a lot of what we call the alt-right movement on this program. We did a show recently about we talked for a few minutes about David Duke on a recent show, and I did a longer show detailing some things that I see as being misinformation, disinformation being put out by the alt-right regarding Trump and Kushner and Bannon and the topics that we discussed earlier. This mentality that if only we had the good good Catholic boys like Bannon and Gorka in there to launch a new crusade against Islam, which is exactly what they advocate for, that it's going to be okay as long as the Jew boy Kushner's not in there to bring his Goldman Sachs buddies in to wreck the economy or whatever, even though Bannon is connected to the exact same entities and said nothing when these people were brought into the government in the first place. And even Trump's surrogates like Roger Stone and Alex Jones, who were very close to the Bannon wing, defended these same Goldman bankers as the good patriotic bankers. So we've had this conversation about people like Duke and Richard Spencer and others. And a friend whose opinion I value very much messaged me after he listened to our show that we did about Duke. And he said, man, you guys aren't being critical enough of David Duke. I mean, you guys should have gone harder on him. The guy's a racist and a white supremacist. And I pointed out to him, well, the goal with the show that we did with our commentary on Duke was not to just go on about his worldview and how bad it is and how evil he is. Our point was to actually take a critical analysis of David Duke and the role he's played in creating the discourse that we have within our society, and actually analyzing based on things he's said and done and based on things that he omits from his analysis and commentary, actually breaking down what we believe he actually means to the overall conversation. And when we get into these boxes of just condemning people based on what we perceive their worldview is, or because they identify with a certain ideology, whether it's David Duke and white nationalism, or whether it's hard radical progressives who more or less fall onto the far left socialist Marxist side of the paradigm, we've almost in so many ways have been conditioned to not even like consider any merits to their arguments, or even to look at them as individuals rather than just place them in this group label of being bad people based on what they profess to believe in. And we saw this with the rise of Obama and the Tea Party movement, where all of these libertarian progressive alliances were made during the Obama presidency, or during the Bush presidency, excuse me, and then in a way with the Ron Paul campaign, the first one in 2008, where even people were talking about Ron Paul and Dennis Kucinich should come together and run as a ticket together, and where people had previously come together to oppose like things like the September 11th official narrative, but also the Iraq War and the ways that the Bush administration and the neocons under Bush were wrecking the economy and were trying to create a police state at home with all of this surveillance and all of these different actions that were taken after September 11th to crack down on domestic freedom and dissent. We saw with the rise of Obama and the rise of the Tea Party where this movement completely got splintered, and we were back to just fighting with each other over this partisan nonsense, over death panels for Obamacare, and Obama's a Muslim, or the right wingers are a bunch of secret fascists who just hate everybody that doesn't look like them. And since Trump's gotten in, it's gotten so much worse now that we're seeing the new Days of Rage play out 1968 all over again on the college campuses of America, especially with Berkeley being the epicenter of the fight between the Trumpers and the Antifas. We're more than ever at a point where it's more difficult than ever to actually have a constructive conversation with people who we should be listening to, who at the very least should be analyzing what they have to say. And I think there's two reasons why this is important. Number one, it keeps us from having dialogue with people who in most cases will probably find that we agree with more than we disagree with. I mean, we talked about in a previous show how the people protesting in Oregon against the Bureau of Land Management at the Malheur Reservation in Oregon would be, if they came to a table with the Standing Rock protesters who were protesting the pipeline being built on their land and government intrusion into their land, they would probably find that they have more in common than they have that they act where they agree on them, where they disagree on. But with the rhetoric and the atmosphere and activist atmosphere, everything's been done to try to divide those two very different groups as much as possible. And I feel it's the same way, where we could get some of these just on a conversation of principles alone. We leave the partisan BS out of it, and we leave all the conversation about SJW, social justice warriors, out of the conversation. We could actually have a constructive dialogue where we might have a lot of agreements on things. And the other reason why I think this is damaging is because when we box people, whether it's, say it's somebody like Noam Chomsky, or whether it's on the flip side of that, a David Duke or a Richard Spencer, Well, we just box them into a category as being people who we can't have correspondence or dialogue with because their views are so out of the mainstream, they're so fringe, and they're so have such awful views that they should be considered less than human in a lot of ways. It keeps us from actually having a critical analysis of what this person actually represents. Because when you've got everybody on the left just saying that Richard Spencer's a white supremacist and we shouldn't talk to him, or we shouldn't even give his viewpoints or anything he actually has to say the light of day, or David Duke or Chomsky for that matter, it keeps us from actually having an understanding of what they really represent. Because when we just dismiss someone like David Duke and just say that his analysis, oh, don't listen to him, he's just a fringe guy who's a white supremacist and he has views that shouldn't even be researched, much less actually discussed or debated in any sort of critical manner, we actually miss what could be a very important role these people play in a society. And with somebody like Richard Spencer, when we just condemn him as a white supremacist and just go on from there and don't add any more to the conversation, we're missing the fact that his organization, through the founders of his think tank, have connections. Family of the man who founded his think tank have very indirect, perhaps direct connection to the founders of the modern day security state. So when we just label these people a certain way, these are the things that are not taken into consideration, that we're not discussing. And it's important to, as they say constantly in the resistance to Trump, build bridges and not walls with these people so that we can actually have a constructive dialogue and also understand how these people operate. Many of the leaders within these various movements operate and what their true motivations are.
Yes, and so we have to be very specific, because this is a complicated terrain. Because in a way, I don't think partially we have to do two things at the same time. We have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. And when we're talking about such icons, and really it really is in that way, the icons of a Richard Spencer, a Noam Chomsky, a David Duke, an Amy Goodman. And of course, people are going to be triggered on these different sort of sides of this by us comparing Noam Chomsky to David Duke. And that's fair enough. But there's also aspects of that comparison that are very, very interesting and thought-provoking. So in a certain way, we have to deconstruct the iconography and the sort of like, in some way, the way that I see it is, if we the people who are authentic and of good faith and are speaking in an honest fashion, if we don't lead the conversation amongst each other, then we're going to have these sort of mimics of these iconographical mimics of our conversation and our beliefs, leading it for us, or not leading it for us. In the case of what you pointed out of sort of the analysis of like, well, people who resonate with some of the analysis of a Spencer or a Duke can't speak to the people who resonate with the analysis of a Chomsky or a Goodman. So on the surface of that, what we see is a breakdown of communication. And this thing goes also back to the rise of the Antifa versus the alt-right, is in some way a toxic mimic of what actually was beginning to take place in 1968 in America, where the authentic left, in certain ways, was beginning to rise up and was talking about free speech in relationship to the gears of power, as Mario Savio might have said, and taking on the administration powers in the university system and how it was tied into the war machine in Vietnam. Now what we see is some type of reactionary aspect of that. It's all about stopping Ann Coulter and Milo Yiannopoulos and punching Richard Spencer. And so on the surface of that, what you see is a replacement by a false and impotent narrative by this allegedly anti-fascist left, that instead of focusing on the top-down, the oligarchical dynamics of the way that the academic system is controlled from the top down by elements of the war machine in the United States, and more by the war machine in Israel, Instead of doing that, then it's all about this going against some icon on the alleged right. So what we need to see in all of this is we need to both be able to break down the sort of false narratives of our so-called leaders that are being presented to us, and this is beyond the politicians. This goes to our intellectual so-called leaders, and to begin to deconstruct what boxes they've constructed for us to stay in, and then begin to actually talk with each other, we the people, on the ground level, and not be afraid of difference and disagreement. Actually see areas of difference and disagreement as places of constructive friction, where there can be heat. And heat is, there's passion there. And of course, we also need to have not just heat and friction, but we also need to have clarity and perspective about where we want to go. So we can use disagreement and debate as a way to amplify the passion of the conversation into a place where we can actually have an intellectual discussion about the kind of ideas, political principles, strategies for platforms that can be transcendent beyond party and ideology. And a lot of this is very to me, it's pretty easy to see a lot of the places where we might agree. And it's also easy to see in terms of like looking at the police state. That's a perfect example of all of that. You can see the way that the sort of Antifa versus alt-right in many ways is not only meant to replace the civil libertarians, both left and right, which there was so much agreement there, from Ron Paul to Dennis Kucinich. There was an agreement there about the resistance against the domestic police state and its connection to the international warfare state. And so instead of that agreement across the spectrum of the libertarians, the real civil libertarians, left and right, you have a replacement with from the alt-right. You have people, so-called leaders like Milo Yiannopoulos and other people who are suggesting that it ends up in the National Guard being called out by Trump to crack down on the Antifa. And then from the Antifa people, it's about how they have to punch and shut down the speech of these icons on the so-called right. So not only is it a replacement of a very authentic, important American conversation about our natural rights to be free from government oppression and insertion into our lives, but in fact you actually have a sort of a collective agent provocateur type of situation that actually calls down more of the police state onto our conversations, into our public realm, into our attempt to have dialogue and assembly and these types of things. So we need to step into the mix here and begin to actually model conversations amongst people who think that they can't speak to each other. And of course, let's talk about David Duke. It is the case that we've talked about this before. When Alex Jones had on David Duke, finally, everybody was, all the sort of the alt-right people were really happy about that. And they're like, David Duke showed that Alex Jones is a shill. And at the same time, we pointed out oh, yeah, why hasn't Alex Jones still to this day, as far as I know, definitely not since then, had on people like a journalist like Christopher Bolin, or a Muslim American like Kevin Barrett, or a Canadian full professor like Anthony Hall, to actually talk about these types of issues in terms of David Duke's analysis of the negative side of Jewish power, which is serious and a real conversation that is becoming more and more important. And then it gets cloaked in a guy with a very nebulous, shady background. And not only in terms of what you pointed out in terms of Air America and Operation Red Dog and all of that aspect, and his father, tied into the military establishment, but also the background of his professed views as a white supremacist. And, and then this course then ties into things like Daily Stormer and Andrew Anglin's featuring of what ultimately we have come to know as Joshua Goldberg, but at that point was Michael Slay, and the sort of the amount of like N-words, and the relationship of just genocidal speech of like wiping out whole groups of people, and then the only thing wrong with that was that it wasn't a real white supremacist Michael Slay. The problem was that it was a Jewish troll. It wasn't the actual content of the speech. It was about who did it. So yeah, that actually points out how fraudulent this whole setup is in a way. And and David Duke can who knows if he's reformed his views, I guess, in terms of his relationship to black folks, and but a lot of this has to be rethought, and people should go look at an article by Professor Tony Hall in the American Herald Tribune that was written up about the role of someone like a Joshua Goldberg and what Joshua Goldberg might actually represent as a digital World Wide Web cultural strategy of tension in terms of the disruption and the destruction of reasonable discourse. It's called Hate Speech Deceptions, Joshua Goldberg's prolific production of discordant fake voices. So read that and then maybe reapproach what we're talking about right now.
Yes, indeed. That article I think is a must read for getting a really different and a very critical perspective on exactly and he pointed out the common relationship that Goldberg and Ben Garrison, who was the cartoonist who was accused of putting by the ADL of B'nai B'rith of Canada, putting the cartoon on Tony Hall's page, or making the cartoon that was posted on his page, and then they all have a kind of a common connection between each other. Joshua Goldberg, Andrew Anglin, and Ben Garrison. And of course, Andrew Anglin himself, there are some circles that he hasn't always been consistent with his worldview either, which is something we could possibly get into another time perhaps. But yeah, definitely these and the problem with the Jewish troll being the one to post that stuff. But when a good German boy like Weave posts things about, joking about Donald Trump taking out and killing all the Jews, that's perfectly fine because he's a good German boy. It's only when a guy like Goldberg gets exposed as doing it that it's bad, and that's what we said is the problem with white Zionism or white, what we call white Zionism or white identity politics, where carrying out the new crusades is okay as long as it's Steve Bannon or Sebastian Gorka, the good Catholic boys who do it, and joking about genocide and joking about how women are the ultimate evil in the world is okay as long as it's Andrew Anglin or Weave who does it. It's perfectly fine, but it's so important to analyze these people for what they truly are, and when we're fighting with each other in each other's throats. This is another aspect of how power works, is that when we're at each other's throats, like even during the Tea Party, the true motives of all of the people pushing the bullshit about Obama being a closet Sharia law practitioner, you're missing the true point of what they actually represent, because number one, the conversation's so controlled, and number two, we're at each other's throats about all of this stuff that really doesn't matter at the end of the day. And the effectiveness of someone like a Richard Spencer or Andrew Anglin or David Duke or Noam Chomsky or Max Blumenthal, Amy Goodman, whoever you want to say, or Jones or Watson or whoever, their influence is actually increases every time they're attacked for their views or for this partisan stuff, and it actually really allows the system to continue functioning even more effectively because they're able to put out their information without any real critical analysis of what they represent. And I don't know, Jeremy, do you want to take a minute to maybe talk about, like, I think this is important with like a Richard Spencer, what the possible significance of his organization, of his think tank being founded by William Regnery, who has a direct connection, is related to the same family that was very closely connected with E. Howard Hunt, who wrote in his memoir that the Regnery Publishing, which is the giant book publisher, conservative book publisher, which put William Buckley on the national map, claims E. Howard Hunt wrote in his memoir that Regnery received CIA funding early on, and Hunt was actually Buckley's CIA boss in Mexico when he worked for the CIA in the early 50s. And the connection between why it would be significant that Spencer, who's constantly getting promoted in the media, who stays away from like deep state related issues in his commentary and analysis, what would be the significance of his organization having this kind of connection to a family that's directly connected to many ways, the founding of the modern day national security establishment?
Yeah, I mean, at some levels, some of this is as simple as a similar analysis in terms of why the Democrats and the Republicans like to get their voters and their base obsessed on what are really cultural disagreements that in many ways should be being decided from the ground up, or are sort of secondary issues in terms of national politics, whether it's, the relationship of the religious right to feminists on the left, in terms of issues around birth control and abortion and these types of things. So in a certain way, this is a way of pursuing a politics that it gets people caught up in cultural differences. And that, of course, is what Richard Spencer, I believe, in many ways represents. And so then why then would there be this then relationship to the aspects of the U.S. security establishment and the U.S. Military deep state? What would they be gaining from this? And of course, on the surface of it is things like, instead of talking about the ongoing sedition and treason against the framing, agreements that are a lot of people agree about the Bill of Rights across the entire spectrum. That is Americana. Not American, not apple pie and beef for dinner and the Navy SEALs. No. The Bill of Rights. That is Americana. And you can see that that's Americana by how much it is embraced and protected across the entire authentic, legitimate political spectrum. So instead of that, you see Richard Spencer even questioning, we're not really about that kind of politics. We think that even needs to be rethought, that people can't really have a commitment, a cooperative, nationalistic commitment to principles such as ideas of freedom and justice. No. The only way for people to be able to actually aggregate themselves is through ethnicity, and of an ethnic nationalistic bent. So obviously that is some type of distraction or a subversion, a seditious subversion, I would say, from the constitutional checks that should have already been applied against these highly treasonous actors and their actions that we've seen over the decades in terms of the undermining of the actual rule of law, in terms of the domestic and international assassinations, all of the MK Ultra domestic warfare. A lot of that is still unknown, and actually I believe that part of what we see with the politics behind Richard Spencer is probably actually an extension of aspects of MK Ultra. That some of it was not limited to LSD experiments in San Francisco. No, it was actually a long-term cultural warfare operation that aspects of what we're seeing right now is probably the result of it. And going back to what I said about the 68 and how the Antifa reactionary is very different from some of the more authentic responses of the left on campuses across the world, really, to militarism and to authoritarianism in the institutions, what part of the MK Ultra response to all of that was to replace the meat and potato issues of war and peace and police state with things like culture warfare and the late 60 hippies and the creation of to tune in, turn on, and drop out, and the reordering away from being against the Vietnam War and being towards living on communes with long hair. And not that cultural freedom is not important, but when it's replaced, when it becomes a replacement for actual politics, war and peace, how is money created? How do we actually create our society around us in a very material fashion? Then there's some type of warfare being waged against you. And of course, go look at weaponized anthropology. This was done to indigenous people around the world, and it's apparently in the process of continuing to be done against we, the American people. There's a weaponized anthropology being used against us, where these different mind states, sort of meme-led mind states, represented by people like Richard Spencer, are being put forth as some type of organic, authentic response to the elite. And so what I'm saying is not that we should just ignore or refuse to talk to people like Richard Spencer, but we should do it with all awareness, and that the most effective thing that real leftists could do in response to Richard Spencer is not to try to go punch him or shut down his speech, but go to these events. Go to the events where people are speaking and deconstruct it with the intellect. Ask the unasked questions about deep state politics, about the police state, about September 11th treason, about how all of this is playing into this oligarchical top-down warfare against we the people. That is how you respond rather than react to these kinds of what I would assert are synthetic creations of cultural warfare against us.
I could not agree more, and I think it's important to emphasize we're not coming out and saying this or that about Richard Spencer, that he represents this or that. No, what we're doing is we're basing on an analysis of what he covers, what he does not cover, and certain elements in his background and in the people who created his think tank and who, in the same media apparatus on top of that has made him into a celebrity. He's very much been a Christian. What we're saying is that we're pointing these things out, and we're laying out some possible scenarios for why he might have the status that he currently has gotten within the media and within this whole paradigm. But it's very important. Real, authentic leftists, the people who are not fans of his ideology, should be asking him. We need to be asking questions about exactly who and what he represents, rather than trying to get into a pissing battle about whether SJWs and Antifas or the alt-right is the solution to our problems, because neither side is. And I guess I'll make one quick statement about the French election before we go. It's looking increasingly like Le Pen's not going to win. That might be a prediction where I might have gotten it wrong, thinking that she may have been the chosen one. But either way, France is screwed. We're screwed regardless of who wins, whether it's the Rothschild banker or the hard right Zionists. So we lose either way. Anyway, we'll be back with another show. We'll be back soon with another show. So until then, peace out.
Peace out.